Okay, let's get started. Let me lay out a little bit more about interfunctional warfare according to this body of scholarship. And remember, we are just laying the groundwork now, because tomorrow we're going to come back and we're going to look at this stuff psychologically and continue to think about the possible implications of this and implications for further research from a Jungian point of view, and also and then think about the war of the functions in our own experience, and what this may help us understand. So let me start talking about now, just for a few minutes, about interfunctional war, the way it's presented in this. And Bill, you and others William, you and Bill, who've studied this stuff, give us some other examples if you can think of any. But as I was going over this interfunctional warfare, trying to get ready for this workshop, I was Professor Miller was generous enough to sit down and work with me on this some. He said there are a number of assumptions and key incidents that are presented that I wanted to get out on the table. First is this assumption that as long as you have interfunctional war going on, there's not really any, let's put it this way, normative social integration. It's like in the myths, what you've got are sort of, these are stories of how you get from chaotic war of the functions to a viable society. And one of the interesting things is what Scott Littleton and others wonder about the movement from myth to sort of quasi-history or quasi-legend, but seeing the same issues expressed. And we'll look at some examples from the Norse mythology, and also from Roman quasi-historical legend as expressions of this. But anyway, there is no social integration of the normative society until the functions are joined as a functional whole. Now think about this and anticipate tomorrow. Think about self-psychology and self-integration. And it's like, as long as you've got an open warfare going on between the functions, you don't really have a world yet. So it's almost like these things are related to creation mythology. I would argue that this is all about how you get where we need to go, in the world. And there is in this literature, what they find, interestingly enough, is that very often the first two functions, sovereignty and force, are at odds with the third function in these stories, in these epic stories and in the myths. That the most pronounced functional warfare is between 1 and 2 and the third function. So that's something that we're going to want to reflect on and think about Bill Clinton. Now let me start to say there are normally key incidents in these accounts of the War of the Functions, and one I am told is called the Golden Bribe. The Golden Bribe, and this is the attempt to use riches of some kind to subvert the, quote, enemy functions. You use some form of riches to bribe and to defeat the other functions. And it's most often the third function that will use a bribe to defeat the others. For example, in Norse mythology, the third function god or gods will often use gold to try to get Odin, the first function deity, and Thor, the second function deity, to back off. You bring gold to bribe. In these Norse traditions, for example, the the warfare between the function is just going on and on and on, and everything is getting destroyed, and nobody's getting anywhere, and the war is going on. And finally, Odin gets fed up with this and takes the magic spear and throws this over the battle lines. And that's what I was referring to earlier, that the magic spear is thrown over the battle lines and everything stops. And this moment is a very important moment in these narratives, because according to these scholars, there's a very important point that's being made here. And what is it? None of the functions can win. Winning is losing. Tomorrow we're going to go into that a lot. Winning is losing. When one archetypal foundation wins, everybody loses. So it's intriguing to me here. So Odin gets fed up with the ongoing devastating cost of the warfare, and he throws the magic spear, and everything stops. And the point's being made. Come to, folks. You know, I mean, we've got to not try to win here. And then, according to these scholars, what happens is that there is a movement to a new level of understanding at that point. This spear, this magic spear of Odin, the great function, first function god, is not aimed at anybody. It's not aimed to hurt anyone. This spear is not to hurt anyone. It's not to defeat any function. It's simply to stop the mindless conflict until what you and I might say a new kind of awareness is achieved. It's aimed, this spear is aimed at stopping the mindless conflict, the fragmentation. So there is a sense in which, and we want to think about this tomorrow, there's a sense in which the moment where synthesis begins to be possible, it is a kind of, it's a magical act of great potency, but it's not a magical act against any function. It's not a magical act against the king, for example. It's not a magical act against the warrior. It's a different kind of thing. It's what you and I think we'll talk about tomorrow. I think it's achieving contemplation. When you move into that positive, transformative awareness, you're not into disrespecting your shadow. See? It's like letting go. There's a moment at which you move to a center point, some sort of quiet place, and you're not desperately struggling at that point to overcome your shadow. It's I think that's really the psychological implications of these narratives. It's very much what we talk about a lot. I mean, I'm just astounded. I mean, I'll sit there and I'll listen to Professor Miller talk about this stuff, and I am just amazed at how much relevance it has for psychodynamic functioning. And of course, he's not a psychoanalyst. He doesn't think about the implications of that. But that's an example. The magical act that is revealed in that casting of the magic spear over the battle lines is an act that allows a synthesis to begin forming. Or you and I would say, allows the beginning of a real integration of these things and moving to a more cohesive level. Another thing which Dr. Miller pointed out to me is that these functions, when there begins to be integration, there seems to be a merging downward in the functions from first function, second function, third function. Now, you and I need to think about this and reflect on it psychologically. What could that conceivably mean? Well, what it means in the myth is, for example, Odin, who has been primarily first function, when the synthesis begins, Odin starts to be more active. Second function, doing, warrior, aggression, activity. So when this synthesis begins, Odin begins to move into the war area. And you start seeing Odin flesh out into the second function instead of simply being first function. Now think about the development of integration in the gods, see? And guess what? Thor, the second function god, instead of being solely occupied with warfare and aggression, starts to move into embodying himself in integrated society, the larger society. And interestingly enough, anticipating tomorrow, begins to be the god of integrated family life. Now, isn't that interesting? Aggression, shall we say, domestic violence, stops being split off as a function and starts to serve integrated family life. Not be violence, but as I would put it in my system of thought, becomes the capacity for healthy boundaries, without which adequate relationships are impossible. So these functions, the first function god begins to move into the second function areas, and in some cases begins to move further into the third function. Littleton believes that that Roman sort of quasi-historical tradition carries some of this, the relationships between the functions. He says in his book, if you haven't had a chance to read it, he says that Roman culture has a lot of ritual, and the mythology itself is not as elaborated. They have a lot of ritual, but less myth to go with it. But that they do have a lot of these legends, and one of them have to do with the relationships between the Romans and the Sabine, the Sabine, the Sabine. Is that the right pronunciation? The Sabine people. And according to Littleton, the Romans and the Sabine are in conflict and having a war. And the Romans represent the first and second functions, and the Sabines represent the third function. And the Sabines have the riches. Third function, they have the riches. And they are the ones that make with their riches a golden bribe of the Romans. And they point out that in this story, the Romans began to pray to the gods of the Sabines. Now think about that. See, if you are of one function, you begin to pray to the gods of another function. There's the beginning of an integration. See, because when you got splitting, you're only praying to one god. So you're one or two gods. We'll think about. It's like saying, as we'll say tomorrow, if you put libido into only one of the quarters, you're not making offerings to the others. When integration begins to occur, you start making offerings to all the functions, to all the energies. And so in this story, the Romans begin to pray to the gods of the Sabines to come out and join us. And so this blurring of the differentiations, the moving across the lines of the functions, enable peace between the Sabines who have the riches and the Romans who have the force. And it's really fun to think about, life, what life is like if you don't have lover and erotic energies in your life. You got force, you got power, but no love. See? Or, as I've pointed out many times before, if you have erotic energy but no sovereignty and no warrior energy, you sink in your own libido. Which gets me to the issue of punishment in the different functions. They point out that human sacrifice, apparently, and I would argue probably capital punishment, the foundations of capital punishment, were parsed out according to the functions. Which function did you transgress? And this is interesting for thinking about some of the archaeological discoveries that have been made about bodies being found in different places. But it turns out that transgressions of the sovereignty function were often punished by hanging. Transgressions of the warrior function were often punished by burning. And I would suggest, in addition to that, probably also being drawn and quartered with swords. And what do you think about the transgressions of the third function? How would you be killed if you transgressed the third function? Got any idea? You know. Excessive circumcision. That's pretty good. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's there too. But what they do is drown you. And so, they've had all these archaeological digs where they have found bodies, lots of bodies, at the bottoms of bogs in Europe. Intact bodies. They weren't broken, It might be related to the same. Being buried. So anyway, there's all this incredibly elaborate symbolism around, and which probably has found its way down throughout European tradition in terms of so-called crime and punishment. I mean, that are related to these old traditions that we're not aware of. So in any case, this whole idea of the interfunctional warfare is key in this whole area of studies. And the thing that fascinates me is that that they're quite clear that that's not a good place to be. That having interfunctional warfare is really the subnormative. And that the goal is to try to get beyond that to some sort of integration so that there can be a society, so that there can be a world. Now remember, these people are not doing psychology. But tomorrow we'll get into what I would say, so there can be a self, getting past the interfunctional warfare. So let me open it up there to comments and reflections on interfunctional warfare. Anything else come to your mind about this whole idea of interfunctional warfare, where you may see it in society, and you can...
Well, balance of all your energies.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we teach that to society?
Right. The whole idea that there are fundamental forces which have a divine ground. See, these people are saying that these things have divine grounds. There is a god or a goddess or both, or groups that support each function. They're that fundamental. But it's very interesting. You got to be able to submit. You cannot lord it over the other functions, even if you're divine. See, even if you're divine, you cannot lord it over the other functions. Yes, Bill.
The one that came to mind about the Romans is the Roman cavalry adopted Celtic goddess Epona, who is the goddess of horses and ponies and fertility, and basically brought her back to Rome. And the same thing happened with Isis, the Egyptian goddess. There was a huge Roman cult on Isis. And so you see, I think this is good examples of reaching out towards those other functions where there wasn't.
And what would you think Bill is pointing out about Roman reaching out to other deities which were not warlike? And what are you suggesting there now about the Roman kind of awareness?
That there was a movement toward integration.
Yes. Yeah. Romans, Mars was extremely powerful in Roman culture. And it can be argued that in Roman culture, Mars was having a pretty good time in the War of the Functions. That is, if you think about how much of the energy of Rome went into military expenditure and military excursions and so on. And then Bill is saying that there's evidence that the soldiers themselves were reaching out to worship deities that represented something else other than martial pursuits, warlike pursuits. I think that's an interesting comment. They knew something needed balancing. Very interesting. Yes, go ahead.
Thinking of a rather large and incredibly involved piece of Greek mythology, the Golden Apple, the Trojan War, and the events that happen when the war is over. beginning with a contest between Hera, representing the sovereignty, and Athena, the force, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Fertility, again, being the one that wins the contest and setting off the Trojan War.
Yes.
With an incredibly high number of deaths and chaos and just all this matricide and all these things.
Yes.
Until, interestingly enough, it's Athena that comes in at the end of this set of related stories that puts an end to all of the revenge, the one-on-one kind of stuff.
Yes.
That says we need to think of this in a societal way.
Yes.
And difficulties should be resolved with trial by jury and all that.
Yes.
And suddenly we're out of this interfunctional war and into a higher level where a more impersonal force is looking at these and making decisions better than Paris did when he was asked to give the golden apple to just one of the...
Okay, go over that story again, because I think we need to have that story, just tell it one more time in more narrative form, because according to Scott Littleton, that story, he really believes that story about the Trojan War is a clear expression of this tripartite system, the War of the Functions, and insights that we need to have about what happens when one function wins. So we just go over that briefly again about the Trojan War, about how it started in relationship to this thing between the three goddesses.
I'd be happy to. The three goddesses are debating which one is the superior of the three, and they ask Paris, who is a prince of Troy, to make the decision. And there's he's to give a golden apple to the one of the three that
wins. See.
And they do lobbying. Hera promises him a kingship if she is chosen. Athena promises him the life of a great warrior if she is chosen. And Aphrodite promises him Helen if she's chosen.
So we got it clear which one we choose.
Yeah, he thinks with his groin and he goes for Helen, and that she's unfortunately married to somebody else, and that sets off the Trojan War.
Just a small detail. Wouldn't bother some other political figures we know. He's just telling the story of Helen of Troy and Paris and the struggle between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And anticipating tomorrow, all these functions, or all these, as I like to say, archetypal energies, or forms of libido, if we want to get technical. All these forms of libido are necessary and cannot be demonized. But I would be remiss if I did not say, along with this story, that when the third function overcomes, chaos ensues. I mean, I think that it's clear that when we need to think tomorrow, what happens when each function overcomes? And think about the forms that it takes, and give examples of it. Say when sovereignty overcomes, or a particular aspect of sovereignty, or when force overcomes. We think about the Mideast, or Northern Ireland, and so on. But in this story that William is telling us, Aphrodite is given the golden apple, and all hell breaks loose. And it's not until Athena, get that now, Athena, get that, here's this goddess that's been associated with the second function. But when she becomes the mediatrix, the representative of whole, the synthesis, she has moved to a new level of wholeness as a goddess. She's no longer just a representative of the second function. If she were, she would be promoting more war. But she has begun to be the more the queen of heaven. It's very interesting. Once Athena fills out, she's no longer a second function goddess. See, she's embodying other functions as well. Yeah.
And also maybe looking at the attributes of Aphrodite, or what we attribute to the important piece that we project our mores onto the archetypes, and that doesn't hold. Aphrodite has absolutely no conscience about promising another man's wife.
That's right.
Her definition of love is different than ours.
That's right. That's right.
But in her highest form, she's Sophia.
Exactly. And see, there again, you've got the expressions of the gods and goddesses on that continuum between when they represent a function and when they move toward more synthesis. Just like our personality, as we'll see tomorrow, when it tends to be possessed by one function or two, and when it moves on toward more integration. So that's an interesting point. I mean, I'm glad that you told that story, because Littleton makes a lot of that. He really believes that story is really a really good example of the tripartite function theory. Other reflections? Yes, Steve.
I'm trying to figure out now, in Dudenzill, is he sort of going towards saying that this number one sovereignty comes online first? Or is that simply not thought of?
I don't think Steve's asking if Dudenzill thinks that the number one function comes online first. I think if you look at the way in which there's this tension between first and second function and third functions, that's a subtle issue. What is pointed out in this literature so far, I mean, it's going to be interesting to look and see as we get to know this stuff better, see what else is lifted up. But they point out not what comes first, but what comes last. What gets integrated last? It's the third function that gets integrated last. And this is part of they think this is part of the ideology of caste system in India. That if you come in first, you're at higher status, and that would be the assumption you're suggesting there, that the Brahmin caste, they're first in terms of moral order. The Kshatriyas are second, warriors second, Vaishyas are down the list, and of course the Sudras, they wait on everybody. They're not even in caste. Don't forget, I want us to talk about that tomorrow, and think about the servant class that's not even in caste, and think about the untouchables, and think about what I think may be a perversion of their understanding of the king. It's like, we need to think about, could there be untouchable class if the king thing was functioning right? It's harder to regulate your passions. It's harder. The most, I mean, look at addictions. I mean, addictions are a third function problem. And they very likely are the last thing to come into integration. I just want to put that on the table for us to think about and discuss tomorrow, because I have thought, and I'm taught that way about the lover archetype. But I did not know about this thing about the third function being last. But I can see what they say about this being caste ideology. But there may be a psychological truth underneath that. And simply being that appetites are hard to bring into integration, so they serve life instead of destroying life. So that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of the order of integration. And we'll go over this tomorrow. Of course, the royal stuff is the image of integration. Why shouldn't it be integrated first? And if a personality has no royal energy, I will guarantee you it will not be integrated. Now, if it's not balanced, there will be very little integration either. But if there is no royal energy in the person or the society, there won't be any integration. If you think about the Mideast, there is so little royal energy in the Mideast. You got primarily second function energy going in the Mideast. It's all force. They can't even be, in the Mideast, they can't even be really interested in fertility. I have friends who own land in the West Bank, in Palestine. And, you know, there is so little energy going into development and cultivation of economic things there that the second function forces have no opposition, because it seems so far between the situation that stands now and having really a vibrant economy, which would be a third function, that the third function has not even got a chance right now, any more than the first function has. It's just intriguing. Other reflections or comments? We still got some time. Yes?
It's a question that I have. Punishment according to the different functions.
According to the and I think
transgression.
Yeah. What function you transgressed?
that different in a matriarchal or patriarchal culture?
Yeah, that'd be an empirical question, and there's probably a lot of information on it. I don't know the answer to that, but some people probably do. We'll just have to chase down the research sources. And my guess is that certainly these cultures that we're looking at under Indo-European, they tend to be very patriarchal. And as you pointed out, they succeeded what Ewart Cousins calls the religions of the pre-axial period, which were much more matriarchal and nature-oriented. But that's a good question. We should try to find that out. I just think it's interesting, that crucifixion as a form of execution in the Roman Empire, for Christians particularly, but others too. But you can see, hanging them up on a tree or an artificial tree, you say this person was not respecting the right sovereignty. And so the Romans considered Christians atheist because they did not sacrifice to the Roman gods. So that's very interesting. I don't know whether that's where that comes from, but I wouldn't be surprised that it does. Yes?
I'd be interested to hear what you think about China, where they are on this, because I'm in contact with a lot of Chinese, and the Chinese people are in graduate school at Northwestern, and they said to get into graduate school, they have to memorize Confucius. Well, Confucius is fascinating.
Yes.
He's all together. Now, I don't think the Chinese are all together.
No. Well, that's an intriguing question, to look at China and look at Chinese society and think about sovereignty issues and whether or not sovereignty there is sufficiently dual or whether it's not tyrannical. And that strikes me as, and we'll get into that a lot more tomorrow, as long as sovereignty is not balanced, if there are not checks and balances, then you get tyranny. And it's very interesting in Russia, they thought they were going to get rid of tyrannical sovereignty, so they killed the Tsar and his family. But, they didn't get rid of tyrannical sovereignty. And so it's an incredible thing. One of the things I'm really fascinated by, and I can't wait to ask these people that know a lot about this, have any of you, speaking to these scholars, have any of you thought about the way all of these dynamics are influenced by the development of democratic ideas? Has anyone written on that? What happens to the concept of sovereignty? And do you actually see it developing along these lines? And would it not be possible to view the development of democratic processes as a further elaboration of dual sovereignty? That is to say, where you have a judiciary that really challenges the executive. And when you have countries where the judiciary is in the pocket of the executive, of course you don't have dual sovereignty. In a sense, you don't really have a balance. So there are all kinds of interesting questions that you can think about. In fact, this is where I'm indebted to John Weir Perry, in his book, The Heart of History, where he is reflecting on the movement from absolute monarchy to democracy. And I think it's relevant for looking at this tradition and see if anyone has ever written about watching these things change or watching sovereignty change in Western Europe as democratic ideas developed. It'd be fascinating to know that. Other reflections or wanderings before we call it a day. Yes, Bob. Yes, I wondered about that. That's a good point, Bob. Bob is raising the question about the way in which these scholars and these traditions associate gold with third function and not first function. That's really interesting because a lot of the time we associate, gold with kingship. So that's an interesting thing. That would be an interesting issue to pursue with them and say, well, why is that associated not with the royal productivity of wealth? Because in sacred kingship, the king is really tied to productivity, and is the source. If wealth for the people does not manifest, they often kill the king. So in any case, that's a really good question. I really think that the issue of gold there is more representative of this whole issue of bribe and of appealing to appetites. And so I think that is more critical than the real issue of wealth. See, if you, for example, if you're dominated by the third function, you won't keep any money. It'll be spent on cocaine or consumer goods or something. There won't be any accumulated wealth. And if it's totally that, if it's totally third function. So that's a really fascinating question and would be one for more pursuit. See what they would say about that. Yes, Bill.
The very first graves in Europe where there was wealth buried with
Bodies.
chief or leader was in the Proto-Indo-European incursions into Europe, where graves with gold and daggers and animal sacrifices began to appear. And so the bribe is probably a symbolic representation that the cultivators are, in a sense, giving the
tribute.
Give tribute. They give tribute to these leaders, and then they're they are indeed very, very wealthy individuals.
Right.
The Proto-Indo-European chieftains are very wealthy with gold.
Yes.
And you're right, that's where the gold is, but the gold is coming from that the cultivators and the basic lower level of the strata.
And that's for us to think about tomorrow, see, in terms of this whole issue of appropriate sovereignty, because in human history, sovereignty has been used to exploit the producers. And so what is really fun to think about is this whole development about some moral theory of sovereignty. And if you bring in religious traditions, for example, liberation theology with regard to what true kingship is, or what I've written about servant leadership and the true king, it's like true sovereignty would not use sovereignty to simply exploit those who are producers and gather all the gold for your grave. But I think that's where we get into the whole issue of a moral psychology of maturation, which human beings have not done well on. You know, certainly leaders have honored responsible sovereignty most often in the breach, and not by modeling it. But in this tradition, what fascinates me with regard to that, and what needs a lot of research in publishing, and I'm sure it's been published in French already, unfortunately for me because I did not read French well. But what intrigues me is how many developed moral ideas about limitation of power existed in these cultures, and how they had a sense of the spirituality of power, and what it would really mean to be a good king. As I was saying earlier, what would the good king would remember that he was not God, but was responsible to God. The good king would not use his political power to do murder. The good king would not use his political power to impose himself sexually on people that don't have power. Now, those were moral ideas of kingship that were existent in this very, very early time. But if you look at the way leaders tend to function on these matters, even in democratic societies, they tend to exploit those without much political power and impose their power. But anyway, that's grist for our mill for tomorrow. I mean, I think that the interesting thing is not so much that they weren't Democrats. The interesting thing was that the moral and spiritual thinking about power and balancing power and not having it be totally dominating and tyrannical was as advanced as it was. It's intriguing to me. Any other thoughts or reflections? Okay, let me review quickly. Remember, we are not making any claim here that Dumas-Hill's a Jungian or a structuralist even. I disagree with those that kind of want to use that word to describe him. He thinks he's doing a regional thing, with a particular historical family of tribes and so on, and and coming up with a way of understanding a particular ideology that, in his view, applies to Proto-Indo-European culture and their derivatives. But in so doing, he has given rise, through his own work, again, only about 10% of which is translated in English, of an enormous body of study of specific gods and goddesses in specific cultures and comparing them. And not only that, there have been a number of outstanding scholars, some of which I brought to show you here in these edited books, who have carried this work forward, arguing against him, trying to say, no, this applies to other peoples as well as Indo-Europeans, or there are really 4 functions instead of 3, and so on. But my point being, in bringing this, that there is, in this particular so-called new comparative mythology now, 40 plus years old, at least, much longer than that, actually, if you start with Dumazeil's early work. But there's this vast body of scholarship which has got rich, carefully done phenomenology and historical studies that are relevant for Jungian archetypal research. And that alone is a tremendous contribution to getting us beyond what we saw earlier, Campbell, Eliade, and Bolin and others, in terms of the carefulness with which different gods and goddesses are associated with archetypal energies. So that alone is worth a lot of attention as we try to carry this project forward. Tomorrow, however, I'm going to summarize briefly what I think the structures of psyche are, and then we can plot these Dumazeilian schemas onto that and see what questions come to our mind. And my assignment for you in your spare time between now and in the morning is to do more thinking about this whole issue about the war of the functions in personality, families, society today, and to come with some reflections on how that kind of theoretical and conceptual issue can help us understand fragmentation, and particularly the psychoanalytic concept of splitting, which is so key in recent thought. So that's your assignment, and I will see all of you at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and we'll go from 10 to 1 straight through. We'll take a couple of short breaks, but we'll work on the psychology of this. So I'll stay around a few minutes. Thank you for bearing with me, and again, thank you so much for taking the time to give me an opportunity to talk with folk about this research, because you can't just walk up to somebody and say, "Could we talk about Dumazeil?" You have to have an opportunity. Yes, well, you responded to my invitation to do so, and I'm deeply indebted. Today we're going to work from 10 to 1, and we'll take 2 very short breaks, one at around 11 and one at 12. We have, as I see it, sort of 3 tasks that fit those 3 time periods. First is just a summary overview of the structural psychoanalysis that I've been working on, so that you can get a little sense about, I said in the description of this course that it would be a response to Dumazeil's work from a Jungian structural psychoanalysis, from a position that I've been working on for around 30 years now. And so the first thing we'll do is just many of you could teach this, you've studied this before, and so we won't belabor a lot of the details, but we'll do a review of the structural characteristics that I believe are the foundations of the human self, and we will begin with that. And then secondly, we will look at the similarities and differences between Dumazeil's and that particular, the research of the new comparative mythology, similarities and differences between that and this structural psychoanalysis, and do some reflection on what the implications there may be of bringing these different, as we say in
phenomenology, these different horizons together, to linking these horizons for just clarification of what the issues may be that we need to be concerned about and thinking about. And then third, to work together on thinking about implications of this work and also directions for further research. That is, what else needs to be researched? What do we need to know to continue developing more insight and clarification and insight on these issues? So we'll begin with just this overview, and then we'll turn to comparing and contrasting the structural psychoanalysis I present to Dumazel's approach, and see the substantial, radical actually differences in assumptions, but interesting similarities with regard to phenomenology and evidence data. So let's get started here. Materials on this work are available through the Ewing Institute. There's a great deal of material available through the audio tape lectures of the Ewing Institute. We are now in the process of updating the list of tapes and books of my work that are available. We'll be publishing a new updated brochure on that material very soon. There are a number of books now, the advanced books on the King Within, the Warrior Within, the Magician Within, and the Lover Within, which are currently out of print. Efforts are being made now to get those back into print. I'm also preparing to publish the original lectures on these different archetypes that are available now in audio tape form, but a lot of people have asked me to try to get them into print form. So we're trying to prepare those lectures for publication in a print format, and that should be done before too long. But in any case, there are a lot of lectures on myth and psyche that are available, and on these structural dimensions of the psyche. I have been giving a series, many of you have been a part of it, but I've been trying to do a lot more focus on the collective unconscious and the deep structures in a series here, and have continued that. Not long ago I did a series on the structure of the self and psychopathology from this point of view. I believe those tapes are ready now. I also did a series on archetypal dimensions of the collective unconscious that are not a part of this self-structure. That is, people have wrongly accused me of thinking that these are the only archetypes in the unconscious. They simply don't know what they're talking about. I have never suggested that at all, and recently gave a series of lectures on aspects of the collective unconscious that are not the fundamental deep structures of the self, and discussed, among other things, spirit complexes in the unconscious. One of Jung's key concepts has been neglected. And more recently, as some of you know, I did a series of lectures on idealization and evil, which focused on the way in which these different structures give rise to different forms of idealization, which are giving away one's inherent self-potentials to other people in projections, and losing power and integrity in doing so. I've also here and other places, given a series of lectures on the way in which these archetypal structures affect couple relationships. The series of tapes called The Four Couples Within are an analysis of the way in which couple relationships, and actually, in fact, any intimate relationships, friendships, and so on, can be structured by these archetypal energies, are structured. So there's a lot of material, and it's available for those that want to study this. I'm also making plans in the next few years to start doing more systematic instruction for persons that have more than a passing interest in this material at a more advanced level. So, but today we just want to go over the basic assumptions and just give that as a frame to frame some of this Dumazel research. I did not know about any kind of geometrical model of the self when I started all this stuff out. About 30 years ago, I was studying. I wanted to be the great scholar who wrote the Jungian interpretation of the occult, following Jung's work. And so I was doing all this field work on esoteric religious and spiritual traditions, and began to realize that the magician archetype was an integrated system. That it combined a ritual elder, the archetype of initiation, and sacred space, and a concept of sacred space. And that those three things together were linked structurally in the psyche, and that when you speak of magical functioning or magical process or ritual process, those three things are always present in some deep way. And so I started out in a way, I was amused by this. They talk about the potential ordering of the functions. The first function, magical, I started with. Then, thanks to John Perry, I picked up the idea that in these transformation processes, king images are important. If you have not looked at John Perry's work, Roots of Renewal in Myth and Madness, and the book that I republished in the Jungian Spirituality series called Lord of the Four Quarters, his book, John Perry's book, Lord of the Four Quarters. If you have not looked at those, look at those. That's where I got my sense of the importance of the king in transformative processes, king and queen. And then began to realize that everywhere I looked in symbolism, there was always a knight who supported the king and queen. Chieftains always had their warriors. So I began to wonder about that, and then it dawned on me that Freud had always talked about the importance of aggression as a fundamental psychological issue. And just as the third function in Dumazeal is the last to be integrated, the first time I taught this material at the Jung Institute, it was entitled King, Warrior, Magician. And it took me a little while to realize that Freud also said that it's love and aggression and tension. So I thought, okay, so that's the troubadour. The lover is also one of these archetypal structures. I had no idea of any kind of dialectical tensions between them at that time, except just the barest beginnings. And I certainly had no sense of them being organized in that octahedral structure, such as we see in Ion. But gradually, as I worked with this material over the years, it began to dawn on me that there's much more structural issues here than I had thought, and that clearly the king archetype and queen archetype are in tension, a dynamic dialectical tension with the magician aspect of the psyche. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. And then I realized that Freud had actually been right when he was focusing on the importance of the tension between eros and aggression. That actually is a tension in the psyche. And so I began to focus more on these structural tensions and to reflect a lot more about the implications of that. And so these diagrams that you have, as I say, they were published in a book called Healing and the Healer, edited by George Cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S. This is the latest sort of declension of my understanding of what the codes, the coding is in the unconscious for these basic structural elements of the self. So in short, and I won't go into all of the reasons why I came to these conclusions, but let me just summarize. There are four developmental lines, in my view, in the psyche. Not one, as some theorists have thought, not two. Kohut says, well, there's the object relations line of development, which leads to the capacity to love, and then Kohut said there is a narcissistic line of development that leads to healthy self-esteem and healthy narcissism, healthy capacity to value the self. In my view, the thing he's talking about there is the lover developmental line, which has to do with affiliation and relationship. That would be the object relations line. And the The line having to do with self-esteem would be the royal line, what I call the royal line of development, characterized by the mythic image of the king and the queen. So those are two developmental lines. But I also add that there's a developmental line for aggression. Aggression is not simply a disintegration product like the self-psychologists think. In other words, aggression is instinctual, it's an instinctual given. It is something that is not to be expunged from the psyche. It is something which is to be matured so that it can serve, the self, the community, the world. There have been many, Adler was clear about that. That's where he and Freud split. And so rather than reducing aggression to a failure, in my view, it is a separate developmental line. You have to learn to regulate your aggression. Just like you have to learn to regulate your erotic life, you have to learn to regulate your narcissistic life, your sense of independence. You have to regulate your aggression, not get rid of it. You have to regulate it. And fourthly, there's a developmental line for cognition, and I suggest that you look at the cognitive psychologies here, and if you're interested in structural dimensions, look at Piaget. That there's a developmental line for cognitive functioning, from immature, very, very dysfunctional cognition to a very mature, integrated, life-giving cognition. So 4 developmental lines. Now, in previous lectures, I've emphasized the way in which Jung was interested in the quadrated psyche for the reasons that we talked about earlier yesterday. Jung, when he noticed that almost every people in the world, when they drew a mythic image of the world, they quadrated it. It was in 4 quarters. And Jung, having a very, very unique approach to mythic images, didn't just say, "Oh, isn't that quaint?" I don't know whether you realize this, but there is a society, a scholarly society, which is devoted to the study of archaic cosmologies, that is, ancient worldviews. And all they do is get together and compare notes on their findings about ancient worldviews. Well, that's fascinating. Certainly it would be fascinating to Jung, and to me. But for Jung and for me, it's not fascinating just because it's historically interesting. It's fascinating because Jung and I both believe that that projection of that image of quadration tells us something about the deep structures in the unconscious. And so when Jung and I look at the quadrated world in China, or the quadrated world in the Hebrew images of paradise, the 4 rivers of paradise, or the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo, or the 4 faces of God of the Hindus, or the 4 gates to Shambhala in Tibetan Buddhism. We don't just see interesting historical artifacts, we say that's the self. In fact, in my view, if you see a Tibetan monk doing a sand painting of Shambhala, you're looking at a projection of the deep structures of the self. And so from Jung, in my point of view, the question of whether or not the self is fourfold is not in doubt. The basic structure there is not in doubt, the fourfoldness. Jung also noted, though, there was a double, that was the quaternio in Jung's work. Look in the collected works under volume 20 and look under quaternio, the enormous information he's got about this fourfoldness. He also has double quaternio, which is the eightfoldness. And he was interested in what is the 8, because all of these traditions focus on 8, and that octahedron thing in ion picks up the issue of the 8, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in any case, so the issue is not, is it quadrated? The issue is, what does that represent? What instinctual energies does that represent? Jung worked on that, and came to the conclusion it was typology, sensation, intuition, thinking, and feeling. I think he was wrong about that, and I think Tony Wolff thought he was wrong about that, because here let me plot. I think intuition and thinking are in the magician sector. I think sensation and feeling are in the lover sector. Jung's approach leaves out royal energies in terms of their fundamental instinctual dimension, and also warrior energies. That is to say, he never dealt adequately with those archetypal dimensions in his work. And so Tony Wolff, when she came at this, she said, no, there are 4 structural forms. And of the feminine. She said there is the mother, which corresponds to the archetype of the queen. There is the medial woman, which corresponds to the archetype of the female magician. There is the hetera, companion, which corresponds to the female lover. And there's the Amazon, which corresponds to the female warrior. So I realized years later that actually Toni Wolff had seen what I have seen first. She saw it first. And I have a fantasy I like to say to people that somewhere in an attic in Zurich is a manuscript where Toni Wolff laid all this stuff out, because she would have automatically raised the question, if there are 4 structural forms in the feminine, there must be 4 structural forms in the masculine. What are they? Turns out that I later also found out that Edward Whitmont, in his book, The Symbolic Quest, does a very short overview of, in fact, picking up on Toni Wolff's work and applying that to the male psyche too. So the line, in terms of my development in Jungian theory, runs from Jung to Toni Wolff to Edward Whitmont to my work, in terms of the focus on structures, deep structures, and what those structures are, what energies they represent. Again, Toni Wolff, I think, in a way similar to Dumézil, did not understand what is in dialectical tension with what, and yet she knew that they were structural forms in the psyche. But in any case, so what do these things do? The king and queen images represent what I call a royal developmental line. It has to do with centering, capacity to be centered, not give your power away. It has to do with the capacity to have a vision for what you want to create and build. In other words, it's your own inner archetypal capacity for wishcraft. There's that little book you may have seen, Wishcraft. If you've got a problem in the royal sector of your psyche, you need to get that little wishcraft book and start trying to explore what it is you want. If you're weak in this royal sector of the psyche, you don't have a vision. You're dependent on other people's visions. And also, therefore, you're not eager to build anything because you haven't thought about what it is you want to build or what needs to be built. You don't have a Camelot blueprint for yourself. Also, this is the sector that has to do with the capacity, the mature capacity for nurturance. That is to say, the capacity really to be concerned about things beyond the self. It's what we call in psychoanalysis today generativity, is grounded in this developmental line. The line, in that royal line, the movement goes from narcissism, pathological narcissism, I'm the divine child, you're supposed to come worship me, to the good shepherd, to the Lord of blessing, or the Lady of blessing. So the movement from pathological narcissism to the capacity to mentor and bless and be invested in those who no one else cares about. Remind me a little bit later when I'm reflecting on the Dumézilian stuff and the caste system and so forth to comment on that. It's very interesting to think about untouchables and outcasts in the light of immature kingship, immature queenship, see. But in any case, so you got centering, capacity to claim one's own power and authority, your authority, your voice, your authority. If the royal thing is not consolidated, and unfortunately, obviously it's not very consolidated in a very large percentage of people, or we wouldn't be in such a mess, then you don't have your own voice, your own authority. You give away your power. You idealize, as we said in the last workshop, you idealize others, you give away your power, you're naive, you're easily victimized. You don't feel that you have the power to stand for anything, really. It is the capacity to nurture, to mentor, to bless. It is the capacity to envision a cosmos, the mythic concept of cosmos, a world of shalom, justice, and peace. Look around you and think about how many people really put any libido into envisioning the way the world might be. You know, the Kennedys are tragic figures, but they had a sense for that rhetoric about what might be, particularly Robert Kennedy, who I admired. You know, that thing about looking and thinking about how things might be. And that lovely Kennedy thing, we can do better. We can do better. That is royal stuff. And honored today mostly in the breach. So anyway, the line for aggression has to do with capacity to become focused, to become disciplined, to actually get clear about a mission rather than all missions. You know, if you really developed in this line, you don't jump on the horse and ride off in all directions. You jump on the horse and ride off in a direction. That is to say, you get clear about the importance of your work. This is about work. This is the doer in the psyche, not the reflector or the experiencer or the mentor, the passive mentor. This is the doer. And, in the New Age, there's a sort of a privileging of being over doing. Well, there's no question that being is important. And that's that royal thing. That's the creation. But there's also the active mode. Classical Jungians tend to depreciate that as being extroverted. And actually that's a flaw in classical Jungian thinking. If one does not have the capacity to invest in the world and to engage in sacrificial action in the world, then one has got some development to do. So the warrior line also has to do with boundary formation, appropriate boundary formation, the capacity to know when I stop and they start. And it's also the capacity to know that you are not nice, you are dangerous. Anybody that thinks they are nice has not got an initiation in this line. The problem with not having this, you can just see this recent public events. You see, there are a lot of victims in these recent public events. And but there's a lot of aggression on all sides in that business. One of the hard things in relationships is how much aggression is involved in erotic relationships. Now, Jung didn't bring that up. Freud brought that up, and Freud was right about it. The sadomasochistic dimensions in intimate relationships. So if the warrior thing is not developed, then one does not know how one is harming others, because one cannot imagine being harmful, either by commission or omission. And if this line is not developed, then you will be unable to set limits on people who are unconscious and abusive. There are many persons who, when being abused in relationships, cannot say, not in a rageful way, but just in a firm, clear way, this is abusive. It's not right. It has to stop. And mean it. And so this line is extremely important. The other thing that is very important about is the capacity to have a feeling for limits. Limited resources, limited time. It is the capacity to exist in linear time. One of the worst things in the world for me, that I struggle with all the time. My grandiosity tells me, oh, that'll not take so long. And I find that as I come banging up against reality, the rule is it always takes longer than I thought. See? So this linear time is a warrior kind of phenomenon. And the understanding that if I jump in the car and I'm going to go X location, it's going to take a certain amount of time under the best circumstances. And also, if I'm not in my grandiosity, I will realize that I also may have a flat. I also may get involved in traffic related to an accident and so forth. And I am limited by the external circumstances, not just by my wish to be there in 20 minutes. And so this capacity to be able to experience limits is a warrior capacity. And people who take inordinate risk and who procrastinate and do not give themselves adequate leeway and do not ask the question, do I have adequate resources for this task? They have not integrated this in this line of development. And it goes on and on. There's all kinds of interesting things that that particular energy does. And the lectures on the warrior within, I go into those. Anyway, the magician line. This is the line that has to do with transformation, really. It is the line that has to do with death and rebirth. And so when you look in Jung's work and you hear all that stuff about death and rebirth in the archetypes and the collective unconscious and so forth in his volume, that is the sector of the magician archetype. When he speaks of the wise old man or the any discussions of spirit guides, those things are in this sector. It has to do with the capacity to detach from a naive attachment to one's world. And this is where Buddhists have majored. I mean, the Buddhists have got this thing down. They've turned this into a fine art, detachment. The healing power of detachment. Sometimes they run it in the ground. I mean, it's an important movement in transformation detachment. You got to be able to pull yourself out and look at the patterns. So the word contemplation has to do with being able to get up, reflect upon the geography, and locate yourself. And this is what, for example, addicts have a hard time doing. They can't detach from their compulsive patterns enough to say, "Oh my God, look at this," or people that have a sexual addiction, don't learn from the pattern because they're not really reflecting on it, and they have not got a sense enough about how much they're at the mercy of it. So this capacity to detach, reflect, contemplate, to in effect die to the old world, the old naive world, and be reborn into a new level of maturity and awareness and responsibility. That is in this magician sector. And so you've got a line that goes from manipulative exploitation of knowledge in a very narcissistic and immature way, which is sort of the rule in our country now, to a mature stewardship of knowledge in a way that's characterized by what's been called wisdom, or knowledge used to help you be prudent. That is to say, a knowledge which is a transformative knowledge. And so the line moves from mere knowledge used to manipulate, we call it Madison Avenue, to knowledge used wisely for healing and transformation, which is at the center of any true education in the humanities. Excuse me? It seldom happens, and he comment by our professor here that unfortunately in the higher education today there's much less sense of what humanities are supposed to be about. And that's just a mark of the increasing cynicism and nihilism in our society. The fact that the universities are rapidly becoming, places full of despair and depression because there's so little serious attention to wisdom. And I would add to that, one of the chief places where it's hard to find any wisdom is in philosophy departments. Because I'm not speaking out of turn. I used to be a philosophy professor before I became an analyst. So in any case, but anyway, the whole vision of the fascination with the image of the shaman is really sort of, in my view, a primordial intuition that knowledge ought to be used for healing. That there's a direct tie between those two. Healing and liberation. And then finally, this developmental line of the lover has to do with a movement from being flooded by instinctual energies having to do with attachment, abandonment, fears. As you'll look down there on that second page where we plot the pathologies, the line having to do with the lover is about learning to be healthily dependent, but getting beyond being pathologically dependent. And as you remember when we were talking about that in the course on idealization, pathological dependency always has to do with a kind of idealization, a giving away of one's own center. So this capacity to be in the body, and here the lover line of development has to do with this is to be here now. I mean, the warrior is the doing, the doer. The lover is the beer in the sense of just the sheer sense of presence, the sheer sense of being in the body, being at one with the world. You know, you see this a lot in these spiritualities which focus on getting blissed out. You know, I mean, really experiencing your oneness with everything, even God. Rumi, if you really want to get a sense for the lover, just read the poetry of Rumi, the great Sufi mystic, the greatest probably of the lover mystics. The celebration of the smallest puff of experience, the celebration of just the sheer joy of being who you are at any moment. Joy not meaning that you're not experiencing pain or grief or any of those are problems in life. Joy is if you're looking at this is what comes when this lover line is really developed. The capacity to experience joy, which is not happiness. It's an incredible sense of the celebration of life, and not just the celebration of organic life for our geologist here. I mean, it is a sense of the celebration of being, the celebration of the beauty of all of this being. And for this lover, read William Blake's poetry. I mean, for this lover thing in you, when that thing is really present and humming in you, it's like, suddenly you're able to see through Eliade's eyes, and suddenly everything becomes a manifestation of the sacred. Whatever is an epiphany. And in literature, there's this wonderful word which they use to try to describe this, radiance. And so this lover line has to do with the capacity really to experience this incredible radiance of all things. And there's a kind of timeless quality about that. That's eternity. There's a timeless quality to that. And this is, as I said before, this is that kind of mysticism which really senses the divinity in the human. Let's put it this way, you're not really idealizing, when you're really at a high level of development of this, you're not really idealizing the other so much. You have a sense of oneness, and everything is radiant. So anyway, that is a movement from addiction and pathological dependency, being pushed about by one's biological needs, to kind of a Rumi talks about looking at the mountain, and before your eyes it starts to turn to ruby, and that's what he's talking about, the radiance.